Welcome to Women of Culture. I'm Meera T. Sundararajan. Join me and my distinguished guests to discover untold stories from the world of culture. If you've ever had the opportunity to visit any of the great cities of the world, Paris or London, New York or LA, a museum visit was probably one of the items on your tourist to-do list. You were probably wide-eyed with wonder when you stepped through the museum doors, ready to discover some of the most amazing sights that you'd ever seen. Quickly, you would have realized that you were surrounded by an incredible wealth of objects, and not just those representing the local or national culture. In these great institutions, the whole world is on display. Human history from around the globe is represented through priceless and immeasurable collections of art and artifacts. As you walked through those vast rooms until you were tired, an unsettling question may have crossed your mind. How did all of these amazing objects get to be assembled here, of all places? Why here and not somewhere else, such as in their home countries? The answer to that question has always been obvious. Many of these objects were removed from their home countries and brought to the great capitals of Europe in the course of colonial conquest. Until recently, it was taken for granted that these objects belonged in the museums of Western countries, that this was where they could be best taken care of, and where the cultural heritage of humanity would be truthfully represented to the public. But this narrative has always been uncomfortable for people who recognize their cultural backgrounds and themselves in these objects, displaced as they are from their places of origin, presented to the public outside their native contexts and accompanied by the commentary of outsiders. Collections of cultural property did represent something very concrete, not truth, but a world steeped in inequality. I'll never forget my first visit to London as a teenager. I was with my parents on an organized tour that visited, among other places, the Tower of London. How strange it was, as a person of Indian origin, to witness the pomp and circumstance, to absorb the tales of British conquest and glory with which the collection of British crown jewels was presented to us. Objects from India, kept in the heart of a British royal stronghold and put forward as British treasure. My first formal study of the international movement of cultural property, as it is known, came as a law student. I was taught, based on the work of Stanford law professor John Henry Merriman, who can be said to have invented the field of cultural property law, that it was right and proper from a cultural perspective, and probably entirely acceptable from a legal perspective, that cultural property should be removed from its countries of origin and displaced to the developed world, for it to grace museums and other houses of culture in the world's greatest capitals. How times have changed. Today, the question of what should happen to cultural property removed from its countries of origin during colonial expeditions, wars, or foreign occupancy is rightly considered a thorny cultural, ethical, and legal dilemma, which people from both sides of this historical divide must come together to resolve. But ultimately, these questions must be answered to the satisfaction of the people who have been dispossessed. The end sought after by all of these discussions must be the restoration of cultural pride and basic human dignity to the peoples all over the world who lost so much, history and identity, past and to an extent future, as a result of this pillage. Perhaps the most heartbreaking of all examples of this kind of cultural loss is that experienced by indigenous peoples all over the world. In their case, cultural property was removed, not from their countries, but from their homes and communities, to be placed in institutions established by those who colonized their territories on land that had been seized from them. From there, it often traveled around the world to be viewed and wondered at by people far removed from its original context. Today, many cultural institutions are attempting to restore the cultural property of Indigenous peoples. One such example is a stolen totem pole purchased by Scotland's National Museum almost a century ago, which was returned to the Nisga'a Nation in British Columbia last summer. To talk about Indigenous cultural property, I invited Myrna McCallum, a Métis lawyer specializing in trauma-informed lawyering, to join me on the podcast. Has the removal of cultural heritage led to a form of trauma for Indigenous peoples? Can its restitution help to heal these wounds? Here's what Myrna had to say. Hello, Myrna. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed on my podcast today. Can we just start by having you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. Thanks, Mira, for having me on your podcast. My name is Myrna McCallum. I am a lawyer. I live in North Vancouver. I also work in this area, but increasingly I'm working everywhere because I have a pretty successful podcast called The Trauma Informed Lawyer. And
Yeah.
what has happened is because of a practice in criminal law and serving as an adjudicator on a tribunal that heard, I would say, crimes against humanity and
Mm.
crimes of like genocide, including cultural genocide. I learned a lot about trauma. And then I began to openly criticize law schools and my legal education for not teaching me about trauma and
Mm.
how to work with
Absolutely.
traumatized people. And
Mm.
as a consequence, I started talking about it on the podcast. And then I just now talk about it a lot in keynotes and trainings. And that's really kind of where my career has gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Myrna. Such important work that you're doing. And for me, as a person, also a person with a legal background and a legal scholar myself, I work a lot on issues of cultural property, cultural heritage, intellectual property. But I've started to notice over the years that we don't really talk about the various traumas that are happening in relation to this field, the cultural traumas or the cultural harm that may be occurring through cultural practices, basically, that are accepted throughout the legal community and throughout the world. And I'm using the word trauma very loosely as a person who really doesn't have any background in this area, doesn't have anything compared to the vast experience that you've acquired working in that field. But what I have is an intuition that I've developed that actually we're not taking cultural issues seriously enough. And in a lot of the debates that are currently going on, for example, this whole issue of repatriating cultural property, as it's called, so cultural objects that have been removed from developing countries in the course of colonization, and indeed from Indigenous peoples in Canada and in many countries of the world. These objects find their ways into museums, and they're subject to commentary by quote unquote experts, art experts or history experts from different cultures, from dominant cultures, who are commenting on this heritage and providing context for it. And this is a practice, of course, that's been going on for a long time. But over the past few years, we've seen an incredible turn in the tide where all of a sudden the desire for getting these objects back, which those communities have been voicing for decades, in some cases even longer, those voices finally appear to be being heard, and objects are finding their ways back to those communities. And we don't really have, I think, an adequate framework for talking about what's happening here at the human level, at the cultural level. And I also think that the reason for that is not a very surprising one. It's because the people who are seeking the return of those objects, or who want to talk about those objects, at least in the context of a removal process that was forcible, those are not the people that have had the dominant voices in this area. This dialogue has been entirely dominated by experts from the Western world, whether art experts or legal experts. So this is where I'm turning to you, and I'm wondering, is this an example of an area where we can be enriching our understanding of what's going on by turning to concepts available through the study of trauma? And is what's been happening here a cultural trauma that now needs to be healed? What are your thoughts, Myrna?
I would say so. And maybe, like, let's just start with the word trauma, because people will talk about
Mm.
trauma in all kinds of contexts. And what I've learned through my work with Dr. Gabor Mate, who is known to be the expert in this area, is he will say trauma is a wound, right?
Mm.
And I think he says the word trauma comes from like the Greeks, and it translates literally to wound. And what he has said is people confuse what is trauma and what is traumatic. So you have an
Mm.
event or an experience that is traumatic. What trauma is the alteration or the change that occurs within you as a result of that traumatic experience, and it becomes a wound that lives inside you, and it just alters your communication, it alters your memory, it alters your behavior, it can alter your community, it can alter your culture, it can alter everything until or unless people decide it's time to heal that wound. And that is what trauma is. It's like I liken it to a living thing that exists among us, within us. And people talk now a lot about, in the context of BIPOC healing or BIPOC trauma, we hear about like cultural legacies and cultural
Mm.
burdens and cultural
Absolutely.
harm. And,
Yeah.
the abuses that took place or the oppression that occurred against a people as a result of colonization can indeed result in all of those things. And I believe that once we understand exactly what trauma is and how it is different from a traumatic experience, then we can't help but see trauma in all of these relationships that exist or all these events that are occurring. So
Mm.
we talk about like the return of cultural items to communities, to nations. We know not that long ago there was a totem pole that is like in the process of being returned or has been returned from
Mhm.
overseas to a nation here in British Columbia. And I think, as wonderful as that is, a couple of things come up that we need to speak about, but we don't hear people speaking a lot about. One is
Mm.
the loss of that object stirs up old wounds about how that object was taken to begin with,
Absolutely.
and what was the impact on the individual, the family, the community. Like here on the West Coast, uh, the cultures and the people on the West Coast all have what they call clans and houses and crests and all of those things. So
Mm.
when something is removed, I know it creates a disruption, it creates disconnection, it creates all kinds of disturbances within
Mm.
family systems, within communities. And I think it's important that we reflect on what was the harm done as a result of the loss of this item or the theft of this item. How did it
Mm.
alter communities, families, lineages,
Mm.
ceremonies, etc.? And then how do we repair that? Because bringing an item back is wonderful. Having a ceremony to welcome the item back is wonderful. Getting an apology from museum directors or governments is great, but the work of healing and the work of bringing back the ceremonies and the songs and all the things attached to that item tend to rest with the Indigenous people. And
Mm.
if there's been a disconnection for a long time, sometimes some of those things are lost. And if they are
Yeah.
lost, that also creates deeper wounding. And how do you repair that? And I think we need to talk about that because we don't talk about that.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that as I mentioned before, I think that the dialogue in this area is really dominated by the frames for discourse that are put in place by people from the dominant cultures, for lack of a better term. I mean, it's so hard even to find the right terminology to talk about these things. But the cultures that did the taking ended up also defining the terms of the discourse. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
And speaking from a legal perspective, it's actually quite surprising how difficult it is to find legal language to try to talk about these things either. The moment we talk about harms occurring in a more dematerialized context, or that might come to have their impact in a more personal way, whether that's personal at the individual level or at the community or cultural level, we don't really have the language in law to talk about that very effectively. And this is something that I deal with all the time in my work on copyright law, actually, because something I've discovered over the years is that copyright has become incredibly detached from the idea or the awareness of the individual author who's often behind a creative work, a copyright creation.
Mhm.
And once we turn to something like the moral rights of the author, where we're talking about the other kinds of interests associated with authorship other than the commercial ones, so rights like having the right to be named as the author of your work and having the right to protect your work from mutilation. These are actually parts of the copyright law in Canada, in every country in the world, even to an extent in the United States, which is always a holdout when it comes to these kinds of cultural recognition, unfortunately. But it's just so difficult to talk about these things, and those aspects of the law tend to get underplayed as if they're not very important. And what does get emphasized is the material side. So this is a long digression to go back to the point that you're making, which is a lot of the discussion surrounding repatriation of cultural objects is just that. It's a discussion around objects. But I don't hear you talking so much about objects, but about how the objects are a sort of a link between the community and its practices. Things like ceremonies, rituals, songs, stories, which got preserved or represented through that object, which in a way has a symbolic being that's far greater than any kind of material embodiment could ever be. So I think that whole understanding is just missing from a lot of the discourse. So it's really valuable to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't think object because what I think about is relationship. And for example,
Mm,
like the return of that totem recently that's been in the news, I heard somebody talking about it in an interview, and they talked about the spirit, like that totem had a
mm,
name because there's a spirit, they believe a spirit that embodies that totem. And again, that all comes back to when you hear that, you can't not understand that these people, and I would say every indigenous person group I've ever like encountered, all have relationships to the land, to the trees, to the water, to all of, like
mm,
we see life and we see spirit in everything. And
mm,
it's a lot of Western folks who see these as objects, as inanimate objects. And we are like, no, those things are alive. They have a spirit. We have a duty to them. We have ceremony.
mm,
We have a responsibility. They give us songs, they give us ceremonies, and we have this duty and responsibility to these things. And Mira, I think this is probably like could easily like become a bigger conversation about this is how we get to capitalism. This is how we get to like
Yeah.
tearing down like the earth and destroying the planet. This is what happens when you've got, a group of people who are the dominant group of people who see no relationship with the land, and they don't see life in the trees and in the mountains and in the water. And then that
Yeah.
seems to make it okay for them to destroy these things. Whereas in every indigenous community, if you ask people about their mountains or their water or their trees, they're going to tell you about their duties and their responsibilities to those things. And all of that is relationship. I don't think you would ever hear, um, you know, any indigenous person refer to, like, use the word object. Where did that come
Yeah.
from? And certainly not from us.
Absolutely. I mean, you say capitalism, I say colonialism. So you say
Yeah.
tomato, I say tomato, right?
Yes.
And it's such a supreme irony what you're talking about. It's so beautiful how you bring in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the world, the environment, in the context of our discussion. Because I think it's so ironic now we are in this dire situation when it comes to human relationships with nature, of which we are a part. Let us never forget that. And now, in many places in the world, we see governments, notably New Zealand and Australia, of all places, turning towards their Indigenous communities and saying, hey, here we are in this incredibly drastic situation. We don't really know what to do. And you people have been here for a long time. Your cultures seem to have a fairly good idea, actually, of how to coexist with the environment. And can we learn from you? And this is just so ridiculously overdue. But, something similar probably needs to happen in the cultural arena as well. And of course, the environmental learning process is only just beginning.
Yeah.
And I'll say one more interesting thing about that you might find fascinating too, which is New Zealand has been quite a pioneer in some of these areas, as you probably know.
Hmm.
And one thing that they've done in the past 2 or 3 years is actually to give legal personality to natural features of the environment. So,
Yeah.
in cooperation with Indigenous peoples who live in those areas, they are trying the recognition of rivers and particular mountains as persons under the law, which is
Hmm.
such an interesting legal innovation.
I know. When I heard about that
Mm.
case, I was like incredibly excited. And I think that there's another case underway about trying to get the same sort of status for a river. Because if I
Mm.
have it right, they did it for a mountain and they're trying to do it for a river.
Yeah, I think it's been done for a river as well, but I
Oh,
know
maybe
that there
it's,
were,
it might be I
yeah,
might have it the other way around. They've done it for a river, they're going to do it for a mountain, or maybe they've already succeeded. But
yeah,
nonetheless, I love it. I
yeah.
love it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, for your interest again, since you're the one connecting so many different worlds here, this is something that I've spoken about in the context of moral rights as well. That is this a new type of moral right that we're recognizing by understanding or granting, for lack of a better word, legal personality to these not only to natural features of the environment, but doing so in connection with their traditional function in the Indigenous communities in those areas. So there's a human nature link there that is very important. Relationships, as you say.
Relationships. I think it always comes back down to relationships. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
that's how we bring humanity. That's how, like,
Mm,
to these conversations, that's how we return to humanity, return to like why these things are important. And, earlier when
mm,
I heard you, like, when you described these objects, like, as they're being described by these folks who are
mm,
not me and not you,
Yeah.
when we talk about the return of objects, like using that language, in my mind,
Mm.
it's very disconnected. It's very
Yeah.
dehumanizing, and it doesn't really acknowledge the significance of the relationship or the impact between that item and the people from whom it had been taken.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think that leads to another point, going back to something you were saying a few minutes ago, which for me, I think it's a very interesting one and extremely important one, which is you talked about the disruption that happens when these, oh, I mean, I have to say objects because, again, I'm constrained by language. They're not objects. When these cultural artifacts, these cultural beings are removed from their cultures. You talked about the disruption, and you made this point that even if we return the items now, there is a cultural disruption that's taken place where there's been an interruption in terms of cultural activity and cultural progress, and in many cases, cultural losses as well. So it's one thing to return the objects, but then what do we do now to deal with that much deeper and primordial cultural issue that this disruption has taken place? And if I understand what you're saying, in order for the healing of the trauma, which is the internal wound, that's what Dr. Métis is talking about. How do we go to that wound at the heart of matters and try to set that right? How can we when this disruption has happened?
Yeah, like that's a like $1 million question. I think,
Mm,
when folks are talking about returning objects to nations from whom these objects have been taken,
mm,
like it diminishes the importance of like the connection between the and I'm using air quotes object and the community or the nation. I would also say that in diminishing like the importance, it's also a little disrespectful or offensive because it doesn't acknowledge the significance on ceremony, on language, on songs, on um, all these other responsibilities that maybe certain clans had in relation to that artifact or that
mm,
spirit or that relative or however it is that they refer to this item that is being returned to their community. And I think about reparation. And I mean, some people might say, okay, well, we returned the mask or we returned the totem. We made our apology. We covered shipping costs. We did these things. We attended their ceremony. Now we can kind of wash our hands of it. Like
mm,
we made it right. And I would say, no, you didn't. Like that's just the
mm,
beginning. Now it's really on the community who, like, truth be told, Mira, you know this,
mm.
our communities are more often than not are poor communities. We don't have a lot of
Yeah.
resources. We certainly don't have a lot of financial wealth or independence because colonization
Mm.
continues and has
Yeah,
ravaged our communities and our lands and kept us quite
of course.
impoverished. And so what
Yeah.
happens is these things return to us, and the work is only beginning at that point. Like, how do we now repair and renew our responsibility to that item? How do we bring those ceremonies back? How do we bring those songs back? And if some things are like, do we have to go look in other museums or other places because people have taken other components that are attached to that item? That will require resources. The other is if those things are deemed gone for good or lost, then there's going to be ceremony and responsibility and some other thing that communities will have to do to create a new relationship with this item. And who is going to support that? And who's also going to support the the renewal for ceremony, the renewal for maybe language, because sometimes there's certain
Mm-hmm.
words that are attached to certain items, and then how do you bring that back? And
Hmm.
the work is just beginning. So, like, as soon as the cameras turn off and everyone goes home, the community has to go to work, and you can't fully do what you need to do to achieve healing, to achieve restoration, to achieve true repair without resources. So, who's responsible for that? And how is that being delivered to these nations? That's the question.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely crucial question that you're asking. Obviously, not one to which I have the answers either, but I think it's
Yeah.
extremely important that the question needs to be asked and to be asked in an audible voice. And the words that you're using to talk about all of this to me are so important because the word that's used in the legal community, and I think in much of the media right now, is indeed repatriation, which is a very limited word. You know, the words you're using are healing and repairing, reparation. See, that
Mhm.
again to me is such an interesting word because here right now I'm based in California, and here when we talk about reparations, this has been in the news a lot in relation to what's happened to Black communities in the United States and reparations to people who are descended from persons who were enslaved and so on. But again, when we talk about reparation, in a lot of cases, in the vast majority of the discussion, it's focused on material reparations. And not to say that that doesn't play a role. That's a crucial part of the equation of everything we're talking about. Again, you raise the question: who is going to provide the resources? Where are those resources going to come from? That question must be answered. But that's only part of the equation because you're talking about reparation in the real sense of repairing the damage that's been done, of making whole what was broken.
Mhm.
And that's a much larger undertaking than just the material piece, although the material piece also has to be provided. And some of these examples that you're giving are absolutely heartrending. You know, you're talking about language that's associated with certain ceremonies and certain relationships, language that might be lost or that might have degenerated, that would be difficult to revive, and that's only one aspect of what's involved on the broader side, beyond once we've found the resources, once we've initiated the processes, how are we actually going to go through the healing and how is it going to be successful? How will what's broken be repaired? So I think this is just, key and incredibly insightful, everything that you're raising here. Can I ask you to take your comments even a step further? Because you said the work is just beginning, and I'm very curious about that. What are you seeing in terms of actual steps that are being taken? Who is providing the resources right now? Is the legal system playing a useful role? Because, and this is something that I must say, is that the legal system, for me, as someone who's been a law professor for many years, is actually a place where I feel increasingly disappointed because for those who are poor, who don't have the resources, who don't have the insight or knowledge, the legal system is often not a very good resource for seeking justice, quite the opposite. So, can
Absolutely.
you?
I just think the legal system doesn't care about relationships. The legal system
Oh,
doesn't really
how
care
ironic.
about, right? They don't. They
Yeah.
they what they care about is what they deem to be the truth and getting to the truth of the matter, and transactions, ensuring that transactions are completed, are ethical according to them, are transparent, etc. And but within all of this, they miss relationships. They miss the impact on the human. They miss empathy. They miss asking the question, why is repair or restoration important? They miss
Mm,
healing. What I have found as a lawyer is when people talk about justice, oftentimes when you ask them, well, what does that mean to you? they will
Mm.
either tell you, I want to be who I was before this happened. I want to
Yeah.
feel safe again. I want to feel like this way again before this event occurred. I want this
Mm.
person back or this money back or this. I just want to be, restored to who I was. The problem with relying on a legal system to get you there is that it's going to disappoint you every time because regardless of what
Mm.
orders are made, you're never going to be who you were before the event occurred. And I think that people need to understand that legal processes are not just. And if you're looking for
Mm.
justice, you need to first identify for yourself, well, what does justice mean to you? And if justice is
Mm.
healing, if justice is making you whole again, you're not going to get that from a legal system, and that's just something that we need to understand. And then we'll be less disappointed after we come through a
Mm.
legal system. And in terms of like what role is the legal system playing in these situations where people are having their artifacts, their items, their relatives returned to them, I don't think the legal system is doing much. Why? Because we know it's taking the court so long to recognize that there's a relationship that exists between the people, the clans, the nations, and these quote unquote inanimate objects. And
Mm.
as long as legal players, so the courts, the lawyers, the judges, completely miss that reality, they're never going to understand or achieve any kind of meaningful role in moving communities or nations closer toward repair or restoration. That's just, I think that's a reality. And it always comes back to the nations and the communities to have to do this work on their own with little to no resources. And if they want resources, it usually takes a really long fight in the courts and it's going to cost a lot of money. And
Yeah.
I think one example of that right now is reconciliation. People talk about truth and
Mm.
reconciliation here in Canada, but when you ask non Indigenous people, what are you doing about reconciliation? They will tend to default and say, oh, I don't know, we ask the local nation about that. Well, that's a problem because reconciliation, I believe, is actually the responsibility of non Indigenous people to figure out how they're going to reconcile their relationship, their knowledge, their understanding of Indigenous peoples. And but it's
Mm.
become a burden that we carry. And so, the legal system has a long way to go. And I don't think that they can become helpful or effective until or unless they start to embrace relationships and understanding that every human being who comes into a courtroom or initiates a legal process has a relationship to whatever it is that they are involved in. And we've got to talk about what is it about that relationship that I should know, but I don't know. Like people need to ask that question, and nobody's asking that question.
It's a particularly bitter point that you're making from my point of view because I have started my classes on contract law, usually for first year students, with the very words contracts are all about relationships.
Well, I think Mira, you are the exception, and I know this because you taught me in law school.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
you
but
had
you
me at
were,
my green worst. Thank you.
but you are the exception. And I mean, not that long ago, I was meeting with a law school dean, and they're about to do a curriculum review. And he says, Myrna, if there was a class that you would like first years to learn, like what would it be? I think he was expecting me to say, oh, well, it has to be a trauma informed law class. But I said, they need a class on relationships. So let's call it Relationships
Absolutely.
101. And like it totally blew his mind and he wanted to talk more about it. I don't know that he will do that, but I think if we want to create more empathetic, emotionally intelligent lawyers, or we want an emotionally intelligent legal profession, we need to teach these people before they become lawyers how to have relationships and how to recognize relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think your comments to me highlight the sort of paradox we're in a way, caught between a rock and a hard place, as the cliche goes. But I see that in action here because, on the one hand, we have a legal system that is not very well equipped, to say the least, to deal with the kinds of problems that we're talking about, the traumas, the cultural harm, the personal harms, the intangible harms. These aren't a good fit with the common law legal systems, whether in Canada or in many other countries of the world, most countries of the world where Indigenous peoples are. So we've got that. And then on the other hand, we are relying on the legal system to serve us as societies. This is the locus of our needs. It's where we're hoping to see justice served, where we're hoping to see the truth revealed. And we don't really have a lot of alternatives in mainstream Western societies. We're counting on the legal system. And I thought that you talked about the legal system as a place where a search for truth is underway, and I appreciate that. But maybe I'm a little bit more cynical than you, because for me, over the years of looking at our legal system, and in fact trying to train people in it, I'm very skeptical about truth in our legal system, and equally skeptical about justice. I actually think that power is a much better descriptor of what the legal system stands for and supports. And going back and looking at the history of law, definitely of the common law, it's not that surprising, because the law started out, historically speaking, in many ways as a tool. I won't say a weapon, but as a tool wielded by those who held power, those who held property. And what's encouraging is, over time, we've seen the legal system evolving more and more into a system where that is diluted. And we have things developing like tort law, like the concepts of harm, at least within the limited context of individual harms, as we understand torts, things like negligence coming to be recognized, and so on. So it's a very slow process where that initial focus on power is diluted. But when we arrive at areas like human rights, women's rights, and so on, I mean, we still have just a huge distance to go. And we're operating against these biases that are built into the very framework of the Western legal system. So I'm even less favorable when it comes to the role that's being played by law in all of this, but definitely hopeful that we need to keep going with this and see a reform happening, major and
Abs-
fundamental reform.
Absolutely. I'm with you like 1,000%. Everything you just said, the piece about
Mm,
truth and power. And, just to clarify my earlier comment when I mentioned truth,
yeah.
I said as truth as certain people define it or see it, right?
Mm,
Like people will, in courtrooms, they will say, "Oh, we need to get to the truth of the matter, and this is the truth of what has happened." At least in my world, when I was practicing criminal law, we need to get to the
yeah.
truth of the matter. Meanwhile, I'm always thinking, I don't think anyone can get to the truth of the matter because the truth is going to
Mm,
be different given the different experiences. So, what was true for you may not
mm,
be what's true for me, or but there's this obsession with truth, and I think that's problematic when you come to these legal systems because whose truth are we, or whose
mm,
definition of truth are we actually constrained by? And it tends to be how the court sees it or how a lawyer sees it, and it always misses the true needs of the parties that are there to begin with, like why they're even
mm.
there and what they need from the
Yeah.
process. And but you're right, like no one, when it comes to law, we don't get enough people talking about power, and power is
Mm,
really underlying so much. um but I wanted to say, you and I are
Mm.
totally in full agreement about how like the legal system needs some kind of reform because
Mm.
it's not working. It's outdated, antiquated. It was built for a certain type of person with a certain kind of lens, and everyone outside of that doesn't fit. And it's everyone outside of that who tends to be harmed by this narrow lens. And I'm putting on a conference in Vancouver, April 3rd, 4th, and 5th. It's called Justice as Trauma. And I know
Okay.
because I want people from all over the world to come together and let's talk about the ways in which uh, the justice systems that we have created actually have become a tool of like creating trauma for folks and
Yeah.
traumatizing people. And what are we
Mm.
doing to like create reform around that? Like I know in Scotland they're
Mm.
doing something really cool, and there's other parts of the world where people are running pilot projects that center on restorative justice and having really cool
Yeah.
outcomes. And so I expect that this conference is going to focus on the high trauma traffic areas of law, which are family, criminal, immigration, and human rights. And
Mm.
Dr. Gabor Mate is going to deliver a keynote and do a plenary, and I am excited about that. Our very first Indigenous Supreme Court of Canada Justice will also be there, and I'm super excited to see what these great minds and even greater hearts are going to say when it comes to talking about the ways in which we become like, we become part of the problem when we're traumatizing people, and what can we do so that that ends, like that practice needs to stop.
Absolutely. I mean, this conference just sounds like an incredible plan that you have in place, and I'm looking forward to hearing much more about what emerges from the discussions there. Just congratulations on organizing something like this at a time which just seems so perfect to start these discussions or to continue them in a more serious vein. So that's fantastic news, Myrna. So beginning of April.
Yes, April 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And I think part of also what excites me about this is it's also sort of on the heels of the American Bar Association publishing the book that I co-edited on trauma informed law. And I don't know about you, Mira, in California, but I'm starting to see a real shift from from lawyers and judges and even police officers to go, wait a second, why are we upholding these systems that do so much harm? And is there another way? Like,
Absolutely.
I love that people are asking that question. We don't all need to have the answers, but like, let's start discussing the possibilities.
Absolutely. That's fantastic news about your book as well. Can you tell us how to find a copy of it for people who may be interested in locating it?
Ooh, okay. Yes, I can because I have just been alerted that the American Bar Association has now made it available on Amazon and I think also Indigo. And so people can purchase it there. And I think it's also like Kobo or wherever people download audiobooks, but it's called Trauma Informed Law, a primer for practicing lawyers and a pathway for healing and resilience. So a primer for lawyer resilience and healing. It's available on Amazon. The American Bar Association, you can get it there. I think Indigo. And then if you have like you download ebooks or whatever, it should
Yeah.
also be there. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sure that that's going to be interesting information for many listeners. And I look forward to seeing it myself. So, we've talked quite a bit about the legal profession and what needs to happen there, which I think is entirely appropriate and really important. But I also want to hear your broader thoughts, just going back for a moment to that whole issue that you brought up regarding the disruption of cultures and what might be done to restore or repair those breaks that have occurred. So we've talked about the opportunities and also the shortcomings inherent in the legal processes, and your conference, I think, is going to be such an important place for dialogue about those issues to move forward. Um, what about the broader approaches that are being taken in communities as of now? You know, given the limited resources, given the fact that we're still at the fledgling stage of a lot of these discussions, what's happening that you're seeing? What are some of the directions, and what do you think we can look forward to?
Yikes. Well, that's a big question. I don't know that I have the answer or even the act. Like, I don't think it's a one size fits all. Like, this is what they're doing and this is what works. So I
Yeah.
don't really, I don't know. But what I suspect is like healing has become such a huge conversation. It's a central conversation for many communities and nations. I believe that folks see the return of their relatives, their objects is a pivotal point and instrumental in their ability to return to culture, and restore themselves and heal those wounds that have been like carried inside them for a really long time. And I believe it all comes back to healing, and a lot of nations know that you can't rely on the government or the church or the outsiders to make you whole again, because if that's not a good business case for them. Because if we're to be whole again, ooh, we might get the land back and we might do a whole lot of other things. We might actually generate wealth, etc. And so it's on us to do the work. And I think having these objects return to communities is not only a point of inspiration for folks, it's also an opportunity for healing. And I know that many nations and communities are looking really hard at how do we heal and how do we center these relationships again to help remind our people who they are and where they come from. And it's all lending itself to cultural revitalization and protecting like the last bits of whatever might be left from some of these ancient stories or ancient songs or ancient ceremonies. And so I think it instills hope. I think it inspires healing. Um, I think it has so many positive opportunities present themselves when something like this occurs. And I do believe that nations and communities are recognizing those opportunities and finding a way to do what they can with the limited resources that they have, and also keeping in mind that there are modern day problems that so many communities are grappling with. But
Yeah.
we manage to like spin the plates and keep them in the air, although I don't know how we do it, but we do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And your answers weren't exactly what I was expecting, but you've thrown open the discussion in a wonderful way, I think, bringing in these themes and these ideas that the objects and the possibility of returning them. In fact, you contrasted in your sentence there the return of relatives versus the return of objects. So again, just showing how radically different these positions and perspectives are. But you've spoken about inspiration, opportunities for healing, and then this whole idea of reestablishing a cultural continuity leading to what you call cultural revitalization, all of which sounds like we're at a very exciting, pivotal moment. And this is my feeling as well. I have to say, just in terms of the broader discussions surrounding repatriation of these cultural artifacts, for me, it's been a very striking moment because I was first exposed to this as a law student myself a couple of decades ago. And the turnaround, so for a long time, the position was just very much whatever was articulated by Western experts, and usually taking the form of argumentation to support keeping these objects where they were, namely for the most part in Western museums, or even in the hands of private collectors who are wealthy and primarily in the West. And in the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen an absolute, complete about face on these issues. And I think even for those who have adopted and represented those perspectives that were common in the past, now there's a sense of shame and embarrassment. So there is a radical shift taking place at the moment, and these themes that you're outlining would seem to be in keeping with that shift, and the timing would seem to be right for things to move forward. So it's very helpful
Absolutely.
to hear your comments there. Yeah.
Absolutely, and isn't that so exciting?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible. We just live in a very different world now, even from the one that existed a couple of decades ago, and progress is being made. So I think it's incredibly exciting. And someone like you taking leadership on these issues and helping to bring together different communities, you're playing such an important role here and giving voice to so many people, concepts, ideas, needs, processes that haven't had a voice and language in the past. So kudos to you for your work in this area, and please keep going.
Aw, thanks, Mira.
Thank you, Myrna. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we conclude our discussion today?
And maybe I'll just add that if people are loving this conversation and they're like, "Ooh, I want to hear more about either the experience of Indigenous people or the subject of trauma or how to inject humanity into dehumanizing processes," listen to the Trauma Informed Lawyer. It's not just for lawyers, and it's not just for Indigenous people, but it's for people who work with people who are wounded. And I think that's all of us. And
Yeah,
there's something in there for everybody.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Myrna. I think your podcast is also an incredible resource, and I'm sure that listeners will be very interested to tune in if they haven't already done so. Thank you, Myrna.
Thanks, Mira.